So welcome to this new project. Angus has invited me after reading my PhD to give an interview style exposition of my PhD on the Christology of Rudolf Steiner. Nicola Hoggard Creegan, who was my supervisor, will join us. She's on her way to the meeting. But then also a few other people have been invited in. Logan and Renand Dumala-on have joined us. And I'd just like everyone, before we start, just to give 2 or 3 sentences about who you are, what you're doing, so that people, once they start watching, can get a relationship to who we are as this little group. Angus, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's really nice to be here, Jude, talking with people interested in this amazingly interesting world of Steiner in the context of Christology and theology. And myself got like a fairly extensive background in anthroposophy. I've been reading it for nearly 30 years now. And it was actually a friend of mine who made me aware of your project. And on reading it, I realized, yeah, I wanted to talk with you. So that's why we're here. And it feels really good that other people are also interested in taking part in this conversation.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. Thanks, Angus. Renand, do you want to introduce, just say what you're up to?
Right. Good day, everyone. Jude, Angus, and Craig. So I'm Ray. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Auckland here in New Zealand, and I am my research project is focusing on anthroposophical science education. So science teachers at the Steiner School integrate or embed these anthroposophical spiritual principles. So,
yeah, thank you. Craig?
Thank you, Jude. So what I've found in my working with Steiner is he gave a path around developing these higher faculties or sense organs, but actually these paths have a very practical application today in managing stress, self-regulating thoughts and emotions, your autonomic nervous system, and performing at your best. And these are really foundation pieces to health and well-being. So what I do at the moment is work with people around bringing coherence to their body's physiology, alongside what they think, feel, say, and do, or as Steiner would say, bringing harmony to one's thinking, feeling, and willing. And Jude has been an amazing sounding board, providing guidance as I continue this exploration around how we can bring Steiner's teachings from 100 years ago, give them practical contemporary application today while still keeping the spiritual essence alive. So any type of conversation where we're able to bring Steiner's work to a wider group of people, I think is a valuable one. So I'm very lucky to be here. So thank you.
Thanks, Craig. So I need to explain a little anomaly. Everyone's calling me Jude, Nicola Samson, and we're talking about the PhD of Martin Samson. Since completing my PhD just under a year ago, I have changed my name, so people will be referring to me as Jude, but the PhD is at Flinders University on the library, downloadable as a PDF on the Christology of Rudolf Steiner. I live in Sydney. I'm setting up my own sort of teaching expressions of work around Rudolf Steiner. I've been reading Rudolf Steiner for 40 years, worked in sort of a clergy position, and really thoroughly worked through Steiner's ideas on Christology. And I'll explain why I then chose that as my project in a moment. We haven't yet welcomed Nicola, but Nicola was my supervisor for my project. And I think, Angus, the first way you came in contact was watching a video of Nicola and I chatting about something, and you contacted her. So, the network that's grown, and Nicola brings in this wonderful knowledge of theology and science, this interface of where theology and science are on the cutting edge of informing each other rather than, feeling that they are mutually exclusive. So it's a really exciting team with different background of interest to comment on this project. So I'll just start a little bit by introducing the project. One of the things you do when you when you write a PhD is you have to write a summary or an abstract of about 500 words, and you have to state what it's about briefly. So my original contribution to knowledge in the theological academy in this thesis is the systematic presentation of Rudolf Steiner's Christology. So Christology is the understanding of Christ and how he works. Now, Steiner has done a lot of work on that, but my experience, say, doing my Masters of Theology, writing papers in academia, is that they don't really know, they know of Rudolf Steiner. I mean, that was my experience with Nicola. She knew of Rudolf Steiner, but didn't really understand much. She knew he had some themes that would interest her. But when you read papers and books, Steiner's hardly referenced at all in the Christology, and I found that a little bit difficult. So I undertook this project to say, I think there's a real gap in the academy about really understanding the centrality of Christ in Rudolf Steiner's teaching. So I've written this PhD in sort of two parts. And the first part was to try and create a way for academics and people who are not, versed in anthroposophy to find a way to approach Steiner's work. And so in the first part, I've written 3 chapters to try and create these 3 lenses or these 3 ways to approach his work. And the one was to prove that Steiner worked in an academic, scholarly way. The second lens, which we'll work on in the next sort of interview, would be on his theological point of view. And then the third lens is, was he systematic? And there's criticism about that, and this is part of the problem with the anthroposophical world, is that they all sort of think Steiner's perfect and you can't critique it. But that's one of the sort of weaknesses for the academy, is that it's unrefined. It's just, take it or leave it. And I, in the second part, then do the sort of pre-earthly or the pre-incarnation of Christ, the sort of the biblical side, which is the incarnation on earth, and then eschatology, which is, the things to come out of that into the future, and bring a sort of A to Z of how Steiner saw that by gathering about 40 different books together to put it together. So in this first chapter, I've created this first lens in what I call an intellectual biography. So to try and see that Steiner worked in an academic way in his approach, and that he was scholarly, I chose to focus upon his development of epistemology. So epistemology is a big word, and this is the problem with writing a PhD and getting it readable, is you sort of have to explain the words and then use the explanations rather than the words. So epistemology is basically the theory of knowledge. More practically put is, how do we know what we know? How do we understand the processes of coming to my own verifiable, authentic knowledge? What are the processes of thinking, feeling, and perception that give me information, and how do I process that into my own framework of knowledge? That's what epistemology and Steiner took on at the time. There were these huge thinkers like Immanuel Kant, Hegel, all these wonderful thinkers, Fichte, Schelling, that were all working on it. But how does thinking really work? And Steiner took a particular approach to this, because it becomes quite central to understand in Steiner that thinking for him is the vehicle to developing these higher faculties of understanding, which if you're dealing with theology, you're dealing with the science of the divine. So that becomes the burning question. Do we only work with text, or do we also allow ourselves to be a little bit Gnostic, a little bit Pauline, and saying personal experience is allowable to come to knowledge? And if we do that, how is that verifiable? Is there a science to this knowing? And Steiner called that spiritual science, which needs to work together with natural science. It's not to replace it. But yeah, so we're working with that in this first chapter to see how through these 4 phases of his biography, he developed his understandings. The first phase was the first 40 years of his life, from 1861 to 1900, where he was working as an academic. He got his PhD in epistemology. And he worked with a slightly different approach that came out of Goethe's work rather than the sort of Immanuel Kant's work. And then he went strange for the academics. He joined the theosophical esoteric community, and he lost his, that people saw him as Gnostic, they saw him as heretic. He was talking about things that was in, the orthodoxy of Christianity were proven wrong and were, created doctrines around why we shouldn't talk about those sorts of things. And he really took towards what's called polyodoxy rather than orthodox. So orthodox means the one right way of truth, whereas polyodox is much more, comes out of the German idealism of the Romantics, where people, brought in intuition and they brought in understanding, self-awareness, emotional literacy, all these sorts of things, rather than just the idealists that, when we talk in anthroposophy about Steiner, we talk about, he follows the German idealism. But there's this subcategory in German idealism of the Romantics where he brings that into his work as well, to say, actually, we need to all be able to go a journey to verify these truths for ourselves. So while the doctrines might be right, if I can't actually follow them through in my own experience and then bring them to cognition and into my own philosophies, we're on a slightly losing battle. So the epistemology becomes a really important thing. And yeah, so he spends, 12 years with the Theosophists and then moves away just before the First World War to create what he called the Anthroposophical Society. And then the First World War hit, and he had moved from Germany into Switzerland. And so he sort of created an international artists community where he suddenly realized, or not suddenly, but he developed further the role of art in his process of coming to understand. So not just the thinking, but the feeling and the art process. And developed a whole sort of relationship, social impulse through the First World War. And then, of course, the First World War ends, and 1918, he starts bringing out all other sorts of initiatives. So his worldly events like Waldorf schools, biodynamics, the Christian community, his threefold social order. He actually even put a proposal, or tried to put a proposal in for the League of Nations. And then, he built this Goetheanum, which burnt down, and in 1924, he died very young. So that might be enough of this intellectual biography as an introduction before we go into some questions. I see Nicola's coming in. Hi, Nicola. We've started recording.
Yeah, okay.
So we've sort of we've all done our little introductions, and I've just given a précis of chapter 1 and the project.
Oh no, I missed it all. I'm sorry.
You'll have to listen to the recording.
Okay.
But you've read it so many times, Nicola.
I have read it a few times.
Yeah. Do you want to just sort of say how you fit in here, or how you would like to fit in to the group?
Yes. Well, I was lucky enough to be the supervisor for Martin, so I've read his dissertation many times and learned a great deal from it. But I am a little, I'm sorry, I'm late. I actually had people at my house and they were not leaving, so I couldn't get here.
That's okay.
Yes, I have been in a really, really, really busy patch, so I haven't had time to reread it again in the last month, but I'll try and do better for next time. Yeah. This is what I fit in.
Thank you. So basically, I've just given the précis of the first lens of the intellectual biography through his lifetime and the epistemology as the focus. Thanks.
So I'll just listen in. That'll be very good.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure you'll find something to say.
Yeah, I'd really like to come in and try and bring this word epistemology to life. I'm going to give a little bit of background, and I'm really interested to hear what Craig has to add to this conversation, given his work in therapy and the emphasis there. But a little bit of the background as to my profound interest. It was actually when I was reading chapter 12 of Steiner's series of lectures on the Gospel of John, where once again, this happens many times in the literature, where he talks about the hugely important work of the philosophy of freedom, which is a work on what epistemology is. And he links this concretely to a direct It's a direct path, a direct component of the path of spiritual growth, because thinking itself is a spiritual activity. So as we become more aware of what thinking itself is, not just using thinking to describe the world, but using thinking to understand its own activity, this enriches the inner life beyond what most people are capable of even conceiving. And so I'd really like to dwell on this epistemology word, which sounds like this dry abstract concept, but there's one phrase from the Philosophy of Freedom, chapter 4, I believe, where he says, we exist by the grace of thinking. Was he saying there? Basically what he's saying is, if we couldn't think, we wouldn't even know we exist. I mean, he's saying a lot more than that. So the whole essence, our whole conception of what we are as human beings is based in this activity. So until we really come to terms with what this activity is, we're like castles floating in the air. Yeah, I'd like to hear other people's reflections on why this isn't a dry abstract concept that we're talking about, but we are talking about something that is essential to our own natures. Is that it involves a deepening of our understanding of ourselves as spiritual beings.
Yeah. Do you want me to comment on that, or someone else first?
Oh, yeah, I think anybody who wants to come in, perhaps you start, Jude, there, and other people use the hands up.
I'll give a bit of a background to Steiner's work on that before 1900. So there's 5 books that he writes, through his student years, you could say, from 20 through to 40. So 20 years he develops this idea, and he has this incredible, I suppose, lucky offer that gets given to him, is that Goethe's scientific works become public at 21, when he's 21. And he was, an up-and-coming academic, and they invited him to come and order Goethe's works for publication. And so he goes to Weimar and publishes his first works called Goethean Science. And really through that he discovers something that he had been struggling with Immanuel Kant, was that we have the ceiling to what we can do with coming to understand things. And with Goethe he started to realize there's other ways of cognizing, and I sort of take this on a little bit in the PhD, because I think we misrepresent Immanuel Kant a little bit by saying, especially in anthroposophy, but if you read, for example, the French philosopher Gilles, what's his name?
Deleuze.
Yeah, thank you. And his whole thing on the 3 faculties, and you can find real parallels with Steiner of the transformation of the lower faculties into higher faculties, just to put it there. And I think with Kant, when he says, I had to suspend my reason and allow for faith. Everyone hears that sort of cliched faith is, an unknowing belief in something. Whereas for Kant and these idealists, faith was a cognitive process. But I mean, and scientists, when you read them, they go, when we reach the boundary of what we know, we have to just ponder our theory, in reverence to what we don't know. And that's that process. But Steiner, it was sort of, I think, was correct in saying, with reason we come to a certain ceiling of what we understand. And so he developed in a second book called Theory of Knowledge, the process of how we cognize between what we perceive, how that comes into us, and how we use reason and intellect to come to a philosophy. And then he sort of posits these other questions. What happens when we go to biology? Can we just use the same methods of physics? What happens if we come to spiritual science like psychology or theology? Can we use the same things? And he says, we use the same process. We have a perception, we have a way of processing that perception, but we need higher cognitive faculties, which he then calls imagination inspiration and intuition. So we learn that through Steiner that there is a development over and above or through intellect and reason. There are these other faculties that we have to develop so that we can move into understanding more living things and soul things and the world of spirit. So, and this is what's, I think, really exciting for theology, is that, and sciences, we can actually develop, and that's a later project in the thing of the spiritual senses, as part of a methodology. That's a possibility for epistemology to go beyond just, here's an object, I run an experiment, I get a law, and that's it. That's a very outdated method, I think. I mean, Nicola can probably say a lot about that too, modern scientific method. Sorry, Angus, your hand's up again.
Yeah, I wanted to come in, and I'd love to hear what Nicola has to add there. This faith is obviously, it's like a huge word in any religion.
Yeah.
I think one of the things it's very easy to forget that science is a project of faith. It's a faith in that this method is going to provide us knowledge about the world, and so people when people talk about the scientific method, there's often a lack of understanding of so like their own faith that is at the root of that. I mean, if you go back and look at the history of science, it becomes very clear that the project initially was sort of like the world is an expression of God, and using the faculty of reason, we're going to be able to better unpick sort of like how the world is a revelation of the Creator. We've lost that heritage, or in many areas of science, that heritage has been completely lost. But it is still there inherently, this idea that using reason we can unpick the world.
Yeah.
So I think it's quite interesting as well, the word epistemology. Now, this isn't the correct etymology, history of the word that I'm going to give, but it is very interesting that at the heart of the word epistemology, you've got pistis, which is faith. I know that's not the correct etymology for the word, but it's sort of like it's a little bit like a Freudian. There's a Freudian message in there. Faith is central to knowledge, whether you like it,
absolutely,
or not.
It's very interesting. Yeah. So, Nicola or Craig or Ray, you want to comment on any of that? Nicola? You need to unmute yourself.
Just coming into this conversation, a bit late, but I do think the work of Ian McGilchrist is very interesting here. The master and his emissary. That there are two ways of perceiving the world. The very abstract left brain and the very sort of more in touch with reality right brain, and it is possible to think you're knowing things and to be completely self-deluded if you're only thinking through the left brain, because you're out of touch with reality. Whereas if you are looking at the world through both hemispheres, especially if the right brain is involved, then your thinking really is in touch with reality. So I think there's an important distinction there. You can do an awful lot of thinking that isn't very true or connected to the world.
Yeah, you need both the analysis and the sort of musing brain.
Yeah.
Craig?
It related to a quote in your PhD, actually. It's on page 16, and it's where you've quoted Steiner, I think, and you've talked about my reverence for the spiritual. This I know with full certainty was not in the least diminished through my relation to knowledge. I think that's quite a good kind of sentence to summarize what we're going. I mean, you often say it's not this or that, it's this and this. And I think that's a really good way to think about this, that it's not an either or scenario. It's how do these two things coexist and actually help to inform one another.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, with that, what you're both been saying there, this as well as that, and what the left-right brain thing, During my PhD, Nicola introduced me to the work of Tom McLeish, who then died, but he gave this Robert Boyle talk, 2022, was it? 2020?
Yeah.
And it's just amazing because he wasn't a theologian. He was
He is, as well as a physicist.
So he's both. But he just gives this wonderful introductions on YouTube, and it's really worth listening to these sort of these 5 misdirections or wrong turns, he calls them, in science, about science is objective and it's not. It's very subjective in how we come to knowledge, and we've created this method that he really just knocked at the door of for quite a few of the scientific methods, I think, in a very refreshing way, to bring some of these things in. Yeah, it's a wonderful talk if you get a chance to watch it. Yeah, Angus.
Yeah, I was wondering if you'd like to unpack for us, Jude, a little bit why you think there's this strong emphasis on polydox as opposed to orthodox, because I think this is obviously one of the reasons why there's a lot of resistance to Steiner in traditionally religious communities. It's too diverse. It's too out there. So what are some of the tell us about your thinking in that area and what your research threw up.
Just a differentiation between polydox and heterodox. So heterodox is lots of out there things. Polydox is more about, I don't comply to the orthodox, the one and only explanation of things. So I've got many doxes, many doxas to explain things. And that in some religious communities, but also in some scientific communities, is difficult. But I think the sort of the gesture of the polydox and the romantics is to allow people to come to their own experience. And if you sort of look at the progression, say, of the Bible, of Christianity, the Pauline experience is, my faith is there because I have experience. That's a faith based on experience. And Steiner was very much in favor of, even with his own work beyond the Christology, was, don't take what I say and make it into a dogma or a unquestionable truth. Work with it to the point where you yourself can come to experience this. So he constantly works between this picture of, we have an experience which leads us to a reverence for things, which is a sort of a religious, spiritual gesture. And as we have more and more experiences which we can't explain, we seek more knowledge. And he describes this beautiful journey between the spiritual, musing or the mystical experience and the analytical thing. So I've actually called, the description of Steiner's theology an analytical mystical theology, which for some people will be a bit of a misnomer. How can you put those two together? And, further down in the PhD, I sort of put that amongst other people who are trying to, Sarah Coakley, Krista McCurland in Auckland, they're pushing these different methods together to come to a deeper, richer understanding of things. So rather than seeing him as a mystic or having mystical experiences, he's got this analytical side to his work, as well as personal experience that goes beyond. His experience goes beyond just the physical of things. And he's really pushing that. You need to use your intuition. You need to develop your own trust in your own experiences of, say, the Gospel of John, or what the images of the stories bring us as an experience, and build that into a framework for yourself. And then, build that into connection with other things. In theology, we call this, experience theology or liturgical theology. So liturgical theology says, the theologia prima is the experience of the individual. And the search for understanding is secondary theology. That's where you go and read Aquinas and you go and read everybody to help you build your framework. But the liturgy or your meditation gives you your God experience. And I think Steiner was very, 100 years ago, that was pretty out there in the Western theology anyway. But maybe not. I might be reading that wrong in Western theology, but I think it had become he was very concerned that it and it all turned to everything needs to be proved by historicity, archaeological digs, very, very much, we'll prove this by the physical facts. And Steiner said, hang on, we shouldn't lose this other capacity to have personal experience and bring those two into conversation with each other. That was his push. Yeah,
I'd like to come in. You said some really important things there, from my perspective, Jude. This idea that we see the world through the concepts that we have of the world, and this is where an understanding of how it's like our own concepts of the world that shape what we see in the world, and if we don't expand our conceptual capacity, so if a philosopher might be described as somebody capable of creating concepts, and if I do not generate these new concepts within me, even though they might be out there in the world, I'm not going to see it. A trivial example, but but nevertheless one that needs to be taken deeply to heart, is there's the story about the South American Indians. It's like they'd never seen big ships, it's like floating on the ocean before, so they didn't see the danger coming. But so they couldn't conceive of something like that, therefore they didn't see it. And this is one of these representations for we have an inner responsibility to develop new concepts so that we can see how there is something living beyond this surface. It's like on the surface of things, and this is an essential part of this process of understanding how experience, often in the word often used in philosophy of freedom, is perception. Experience meets the conceptual life, and that it's when we've got this unity that you've got the possibility of discovering to what extent something is true or not, whether something that I've invented in my mind is just mere fantasy, or whether it's the concepts that I've created are actually something that are adequate for describing the world around me.
And that's what
and I think you were
saying is, when you have your picture, you've got to, ground it in reality. Otherwise, you go off on these. You've got to have both. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that you also, I think that when you talk about Hegel, on page 23 there, I think this is relevant to what we're talking about here. When you say the second realization was that Hegel was only a thinker, the spiritual world for him was within thought. I sensed his lack of feeling for the world of spirit, which to me was directly perceptible. Yeah. I think this encapsulates this idea that we're trying to...
And this is what makes Steiner difficult to approach, because you can immediately see why people go, well, how do we know what he's talking about is true? Because it's his spiritual perception that he's giving these imaginations with, saying, well, verify it for yourself. And it makes it very difficult to you can't say, well, you're wrong, but you also can't say you're right. And so people back off from a lot of the stuff. I mean, I know Nicola and I had some, and I know Craig and I have had some really interesting conversations around some of the Christological pictures that emerge as you go through the PhD, like, oh, wow, where did that come from? Yeah. So and how do you digest that? And a lot of that with Steiner is, you've got to, like you do with, maybe I've just been around Steiner's work for 40 years too long. You've got to let it work on you, like you do with reading the gospel. You read the events of Holy Week. You read, the words on the cross, and you ponder them. This whole thing of pondering, letting it, go through my soul a few times, and I can say yes to some things, but then slowly but surely these things start to make sense as I do the analytical work, plus the pondering mystical side to it. It just takes a long time, but so does any theological process. I mean, you try and read Pannenberg or There's huge stuff to digest. And, you know, he's only one of the systematic, you know, you read Sarah Coakley, it's just massive stuff that you've got to, as a process, you've got to take in and come to some, you know, warm feeling about, and then go and verify it in your experience. I don't think that process is too different, except some of the content's a bit more way out. Right. We can't hear you.
Sorry, I think what you're talking about, and we've had plenty of these conversations around almost saying yes before you know. But I think that the challenge, well, I've experienced is often wanting to rush that out into the world as well, rather than being able to just say no, say yes myself, and then do the work and hold it inside before you then begin to try and talk about something that potentially you haven't verified as an experience yourself. So, you know, there's a real modern gesture to that, right? How quickly we have to get things out in the world, whether it's via an email or a text or a conversation, as opposed to just being able to hold that within. I work on it myself, but I also let it work on me. And then once that becomes something that we can then put out into the world in a more sort of coherent manner, that's probably a lesson learnt for me along my journey, which I thought I'd share.
Yeah, can you remember what you texted me the other day about when you were reading Emil Bock's book? About, you texted me this brilliant text. I can't even remember. It was something along the lines of, "Oh my God, this is just so amazing," and I feel like I'm reading something I know, but then I'm also a little bit sort of upset that I've forgotten about it, or something like that.
It's a bizarre experience. I'll do my best to explain it. It's a bizarre experience where I'm reading something for the first time, yet there's an inner knowing around it, which is a bit sort of makes me a little bit uncomfortable. But there's also this agitation around, I can't believe I've forgotten this. So it's this real conflict that I'm getting better at keeping within a smaller circle. But yeah, that happened with the Emil Bock, the 3 Years book, where, you know, reading it for the first time, but feeling like I'd already knew some of the stuff in there. So it's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah. I thought that was a brilliant observation, actually. Yeah.
Bring it back to thinking. What you're describing there. I'll continue to do this because
please.
It's one of my passions.
Yeah.
I think this is one of the fascinating things that does happen. There's one of the concepts that's like really difficult. It's like when you're looking at Steiner's epistemology and his philosophy, is this idea of what pure thinking is. And I'm not going to try and unpack it here, but what Craig just described there is something that becomes a more regular experience to somebody who practices this. It's this sensation of somehow being outside this world for a while, but what the content of one's own thinking is deeply relevant to this world, so that when you come back to this world from your little excursion in thinking, the world is somehow richer. It is often this experience that Craig just described. It's like, oh wow, how could I not know something that is so obvious, but remembering that I was in that state of ignorance. Yeah. And that this, as we deepen into in our prayer, concentration, meditation, whatever our own personal choices on that in that field is, it becomes an increasingly common experience of wow, and how this other side enriches me. I do think it's worth dwelling on these points that other people might call spiritual experiences, and in Steiner's terms, that's exactly what they are: because we know the Spirit
Yeah.
through like thinking, meeting, experience.
I agree with you 100%, but I do need to make a comment here. In having gone through writing this document, was also, what does the world have to tell anthroposophy? Because we can get very insular in our wonderful experiences of Steiner, you know, working with Nicola. There's so many traditions that are working on this process of reading, you know, of how do you read a scientific document, or how do you read the Bible? Sarah Coakley talks about, you know, this thing of silence. Just be silent and let it work upon you, and you will come to these amazingly transformative, you know, not just transformative in your thought, but literally opening the spiritual senses, which is exactly what Steiner says. So that's what I found really exciting, is that, you know, I think there are methods out there, or people who are, you know, Richard Raw, all these different people who are working in a way with a mystical process, coming up with these incredible ways of reading texts. There's like a real renaissance going out there, I think, of that aligns with what Steiner said. That was what I found to be so good, is that I think Steiner's work is becoming more contemporary than in his own day, because there's a bit of a renaissance in method in the world out there, and in traditions, even in churches. I think there's much more sort of contemplative approaches to things than just here's the truth. So yeah, just so we remember that that's the interface with this document. Yeah.
And another aspect of that interface was also something that Craig was referring to. When we try to communicate these ideas in faltering terms, it's that when we get that actually feedback, when people don't understand, or when they find holes in our reasoning, that is also a service that we are. The community is providing service to the individual, and we are providing service to the community by actually like opening up these topics.
Nicola, it looks like you're about to say something.
No, I'm just listening.
Right.
So there's an sorry, go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I love Angus's expression around a little excursion into thinking. I think that's something for us to consider as well when we. He said it. When we return from our little excursion.
Yeah.
I think that's a great term, because we think we spend so much time thinking. Perhaps we're not. You know, it's an actual. I think that's something to consider, that, you know, we only ever get to these little excursions into actual thinking, and we should cherish them a little bit more than we probably do.
Yeah. And that's definitely, you know, this whole thing of, you know, epistemology, coming back to the original question of thinking about thinking. You know, we think about, you know, atoms, we think about animals, we think about the world, we think about climate change, and we come up with solutions. But Steiner's opening question on epistemology is, how often do we think about thinking? And coming to this thing of, actually, when am I using what we would call generative thinking? You know, not just downloading thinking or emotive thinking, or all sorts of other kinds of thinking that we apply to engage with the world. But at what point do we actually step back and go, you know what, I need to really think about that? I mean, someone like Teilhard de Chardin also spoke about that, you know, where a creature reflects upon its instinct or its desire, and that's where thinking is born. Like, you know, why am I hungry? Those kind of moments. And you know, as Craig said, I think Steiner was very concerned that we notice how little we really think about things, and how little we think about how we think. Now, how do we really come to a concept? And especially then when it goes beyond the definition of physical lawfulness around the world. Is there a ceiling we can break through with other kinds of intuition than just that, without losing the reason and the intellectual processes of analysis and discernment? Can we extend our capacity? And that's really where his epistemology goes.
Can I ask a question there, Jude? Because it's an area that I'm interested in, and I don't know if this ever became part of your research project, but GA 4074 is called The Redemption of Thinking, and it's where
Yep.
Steiner looks at it's like the role of Thomas of Aquinas, or like being essential for reforming like the Catholic Church's understanding of what thinking is, or reason, like as part of faith. How does this epistemology question that we've got going here, and the faith question that Aquinas is trying to resolve, have you made any connections there, or interesting observations in your own research?
Yeah, look, when I read that, I brought that book into the research, and again, it's that problem of your PhD being your worst document, because you have to leave so much out. And when I was reading that book, I thought I should just write a PhD about this book.
Yeah.
In a way, that book, The Redemption of Thinking, is a further, further realizations of Steiner about his own philosophy of freedom. And there are problems with the philosophy of freedom. This is part of I think the wonderful thing of doing this kind of project, is you learn to critique Steiner's work as well, and saying, look, there's a gap there. And here's where he comes back to it 20 years later, 25 years later, and goes, you know what, I need to redress that. And how do we actually take those two and come to a more mature response to his process around thinking? Yeah. And look, that's an amazingly dense cycle. And we try and compact it into 3 paragraphs. And then your supervisors go, explain.
Yeah, and then you need the whole context of 13th century,
I need another
14th
chapter,
century
yeah.
Italy. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think I read recently that Thomas Aquinas was the most ever research has been done actually specifically on his book, the Summa Theologia, which is like 6,000 pieces of research. So, and how are you going to work with that and create some new knowledge out of there?
Exactly. Yeah. I'm just trying to see if there's a sort of a segue into maybe next time. So in the second chapter, I really try to create the second doorway for people who want to read Steiner to read him, which we call a lens. And I sort of do it in 2 parts. And that's, how can we, Steiner wasn't a trained theologian. It's my claim that we could call him a theologian from this point of view. And to do so, I needed to define what we call a hermeneutical lens or key. So the hermeneutics is your key by which you interpret things. And I named that. And also his theological, his philosophical model for theology. And I spent some time doing that. But I also sort of situate him amongst the scientists, the philosophers and theologians of his time in the second. So really to avoid that Nicola's comment of, Steiner was off on a tangent with his theosophical friends and we lost him and he came up with all these wild claims and therefore we can't listen to him. I sort of try to bring him back into a context through which the academy can actually go, oh, you know what? We didn't see that before, because he never really wrote about it. He didn't publish about it. After he left, once he started working in 1900 in the theosophical world, he just stopped attending. and so people lost how to deal with him. So that second chapter is going to be quite an interesting one to unpack as well. Yeah.
What day are we going to do that? Is it the 15th of March?
Yeah, in 2 weeks, I think we said, yeah. And then there's a problem with that, in that the following one is Good Friday. We're going to have to find another time for that.
Yeah.
I don't think I can do Good Friday evening.
No, we can't do Good Friday. No.
Yeah, no. Anyway, we can talk about that by email about the third one.
So is that the same time next time?
That's the idea. Is that okay for you?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Same time. At some point, time change happens, doesn't it?
Oh, it does. Yes.
Yeah, we do need to be a bit careful, but I think it makes it easier for us.
Yeah, it does.
I think
it comes all closer. Yeah. But I think New Zealand and Australia are at least, anyway, it doesn't all happen on the same day.
That doesn't happen on the same day, no.
So we can do some research about that. I don't think it's March though. I think in Australia it's April, but I think New Zealand, we can research that and talk outside of the recording.
Yeah.
We've lost Renand, so I might have to write to him and ask him.
Yeah.
It was a bit difficult to try and include him dropping in and out like that.
I would just like to flag, I mean, there were so many areas, the whole ethical individualism part that you tried to get. It would have been lovely to talk about that. I mean, you could probably talk about for half an hour just about that. So we've only really sort of like scratched the surface of
and look,
a really rich first
one of the
chapter.
things that came up for me in looking at the questions you write, I mean, we've only touched one of your questions this evening, let alone what everyone else has to ask. I thought it might be good in between to actually do a half hour just on my own. Here's chapter 1, here's a précis of chapter 1, rather than reading it. Give a bit more of a detailed content of the chapter so that they can sort of listen to it in connection with this, and there may be future questions around chapter 1 if we come back around at some point.
Yep, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Angus, you're at the beginning of your day, so you're more bouncy than we are.
Yeah.
That's right, yes. Apologies.
No, that's good. Good.
Okay, I'm going to stop that recording.